The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning to the viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. This show today is part 5 of a series dealing with Black and African Centered Education. Lawrence, bring the other 2 up on the screen. And bring the 3rd one up. Got it, Ajamu. Bring up Leon. Yeah, okay. And then bring the stream that's below that comes on. And then bring the streamer that's below on the screen. Okay, greetings to the viewers of the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. This show today is part 5 of a series dealing with Black and African Centered Education. And so we want to welcome all the viewers to this show. And this show is the icing on the cake because this is the show that's going to deal with practice and the application of what we've been talking about, both in Black studies and in Afrocentric thought. And so before getting into today's show, I want to briefly introduce, and then later I'll go into a detailed introduction of our two guests, Brother Ajamu Webster and Brother Leon Dixon, two buddies that I've known for many years. Welcome, Ajamu, and welcome, Brother Leon. How you all doing?
Doing great. It's an honor. Thanks for having us on the show.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you on. How you doing, Leon?
My usual C+.
All right.
Slightly better than average.
Okay. Y'all hear that? That's called middling for the older generation. But that's an understatement because you're going to see in a minute. This is one of these brilliant brothers. Both of them are, who you see walking through the community. You don't know what you're looking at sometimes, unless you're from Kansas City or from places where you know who they are. So this is a real honor to have both of you on. And Lawrence, have you got the chat thing up? Chat up? Yeah, okay, good. Greetings to our viewers, Loud to Zoo, Cinnabar, Sister Robin, one of our real dedicated viewers, Brother Ugawa, who's been working hard on the show. So you're going to have a real treat today because in the movement for Black liberation, there are a couple of things you need, one of which is victories, and the other of which is models. And models are really what give you the basis for victories. And so today we're going to get exposed to two models, two central models, one in the public schools and the other in what Leon Dixon prefers to call supplementary schools, or more popularly known as after schools. These are the two models for the United States. They're the best. These two guests we have are too humble to say it. I'll say it, you know what I mean? Because I've been all over the country. I know what's good out there. This is the best. You hear me? So you're in for a treat because you're going to get exposed to two masters in a number of different domains. And you're also going to get treated to something else. First time you're going to get some music on this show. A little soul. You all know that Black folks love their music, and I'm one. So hit us with this Let's Dance. Get this in here right now.
While the music is still playing, let's dance while the floor is still swaying. This moment will never come again. So let's dance while the music's playing. Let's dance for the sweet love that we found. This moment will never ever come again. So let's dance for the sweet love we found.
and get a Johnny. Just add a Johnny, you'll be in. Okay, you got a little treat to the music. We'll have to work out that dark spot, but that was okay. You know what I mean? From now on, you're going to have some music in this show. So it's customary to this show, before getting into introducing the guest and the topic, I wanted to deal with a news item. And this news item has to do with Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, the nominee for the Supreme Court's home training. I wanted to deal with her home training because this is a show. Get Ajamu back in there. This is a show that is focusing on Black and African Centered Education. And Black culture is a key part of this, which is an outgrowth of African culture created by Blacks in the United States. Get Ajamu back in there. So this is important because I made the point a couple of weeks ago that the appointment of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court was important because she was the best of the choices, and didn't mean I was endorsing her. It was simply a reflection of what I could see. This is a sister. And so what I want to do is just focus on a few things that have been important in her life that are key for most Black folks. And it also ties into the topic for today that is dealing with African Centered Education. First of all, we know that she has an African name. She actually has two, Ketanji Onyeka, which means lovely one. And this is one of many names sent to her family by her mother's sister, who was working in the Peace Corps in Africa. And this is the one they picked. She's very proud of this name. That should tell you something. And she's born in 1970, and this is a time when Black folks were beginning to take on African names or African American names with an African sound. And they really pick up the spirit of our people. And so this was key. Her parents, like King, who we've discussed as a product of Black culture, were middle-class Blacks. The majority of Blacks are not, but they were middle-class Blacks, contrary to the stereotype, proud of being Black. And one was a teacher and administrator. One had been and then became a lawyer, her father. Both her parents left her this message. They were grooming her for greatness. This is the key point. And this is not unusual in African American culture, by the way. You understand? This is quite a common thing for a whole lot of Black folks. In fact, I want to make this observation. When it comes to Black families, the majority of Black families are functional. We all got dysfunction. Nobody's perfect, but they're basically just, functional. But the picture we would get is contrary. And that's a hell of an achievement given what we've gone through. So Ketanji is a beautiful Black-skinned sister who's a mirror of both her parents. If you saw them at the hearing, they are also. And you could see the uprightness of the father and the pride of the mother, and you could see it in the daughters. Now, this is what Ketanji said about her upbringing. She said, quote, as a dark-skinned Black girl who was often the only person of color in my class, club, or social environment, my parents knew that it was essential that I develop a sense of my own self-worth that was in no way dependent on what others thought about my abilities. Now, this is real key. The parents were teaching her to see herself through her eyes, not through the eyes of others. This is real key because this is the key to healthy Black identity, healthy African identity, and this is a key to mental self-determination. Lawrence, bring the chat back up. So this is central to her identity. And if you checked out how she handled the hearing, you could see that there were times she would have liked to leap across the aisle, especially when she was being interviewed by the senator from South Carolina who was displaying his savagery and barbarism. Some people interpret this as an insult to her. That was his attempt to insult her. He was the insult. I mean, if anybody watched him, you could have put him in a zoo, in a cage, and feed him something. You know what I mean? Because what he was being fed on was hate. And she did try and get her point over that she thought this was an interview for the Supreme Court, not for his fantasies on pedophilia, which I think he must have a problem with. I know this was an attempt to appeal to his base. So you saw in her dignity and stuff and her brilliance what's going on there. So I'm not endorsing her. I'm a revolutionary. She's not. She's going on the Supreme Court, one of the most backward institutions in the country. The most backward is corporate America. And the Supreme Court's a mouthpiece for it. But if there's anybody that's going to get on there and jack people up a little bit, it's probably going to be her. It's going to take a while for her to get in the majority. And she's going to be sitting next to Clarence Thomas, who she observed when she attended some banquet or something where she was sitting next to him. She said, I knew his experience because he come out of South Carolina, Geechee, but I don't recognize him. Meaning, I don't recognize his thought pattern. I don't recognize anything that's coming out of his mouth. And so it's going to be an interesting confrontation on the Supreme Court to get a representation of Blackness and one of pure self-hatred. What a shame and what a beautiful thing. So I want to stress this again. She's on that court because Black people, under the leadership of Black Lives Matter and a mishandled COVID, put Trump out of the White House, ready for the jailhouse. It just seems to be people are awful slow in putting their case together. So she's your product. And you need to learn how to claim victories. Yeah, this ain't going to make a big difference in your life, you'll say, but hey, it's an achievement, just like that vice president is that you didn't see a lot of either. You know, in terms of her qualification, you would have preferred someone more militant, but you put her there too. That's some power. Give yourself some credit. Pat yourself on the back. So I just wanted to start with that. Now, getting to the show. The topic for today's show is Afrikan Centered Education's greatest achievement at the public school and after school level in the United States. We're talking to two esteemed organizers, leaders, thinkers, brilliant people who represent the two models for Black education, one in the public school system and the other in the supplementary school system, both based in Kansas City, Missouri, where one of your greatest jazz masters came from. Y'all know who that was? Y'all know? Can y'all tell them who that was?
Go ahead, Baba Dixon. I know you. We both know, but go ahead and tell them.
Charlie Parker, of course.
Charlie Parker, Bird, as they called him. Brother so talented that after they threw a cymbal at him when he was performing in the beginning of his career, he went into the mountains and took Prez, one of the great saxophone players, with him, slowed his music down, listened to how he played, Lester Young, and then came back and blew everybody away. And you had saxophone players throwing their saxophones in the river after they heard him play. He was one that is an example of Black genius that Dizzy said, God gives some of us more than others. Some of us have to practice hard. Once Bird got it, he didn't have to. You know what I mean? So they coming from KCville, Missouri, and they're also straight. Make sure you say Missouri on it. So these are two beautiful brothers. And one is Brother Leon Dixon, co-founder of the best supplementary or after-school program in the United States, the W.E.B. the Bois Learning Center. And the other esteemed guest is Brother Ajamu Webster, who was leader of the Afrikan Centered Collegium Campus and Pre-K through 12th grade public school project consisting of 1,100 Black Kansas City students, where Blacks under Ajamu's leadership ran this operation from top to bottom for 22 years, contrary to popular opinion that you can't run anything in the public schools, contrary to the popular opinion that we should just leave it alone and we should just have independent Black schools, which I come out of a group that has one and others do, but most Blacks are going to stay in the public schools. So what are you going to do with the majority of our youth who are in the public schools? You better control that space, because this show started with Black Power and the Black Freedom Movement and how it produced the consciousness that led to Black studies. And then the second show focused on how you control your space. In this case, in the university and the community. This one is, how do you control some of that space in the public schools where your tax dollars go? So this is the purpose of this show. The purpose of this show is so you can look at master models and then figure out how can you apply that to your community to today. I'm not just doing stuff to give you some history, which is important. This is very important. But so you can make the past serve the present. So I want to welcome both Brother Leon and Ajamu back. And this time, first, before getting into them introducing themselves, I want to note that I've known each of these for a long time. Brother Ajamu was reminding me of when I came down to Baton Rouge, Southern University there, and spoke before the BSU and the students, and he had brought me down, his group had brought me down. And then the second time, we brought down a team of people from the Pan-African People's Organization. We drove down by car to train the youth in the sixfold stages to mental freedom, which is basically the basis for transformation of consciousness. So that was in 1979. And then we formed the National Black United Front. And guess who's up there from Kansas City? I'm wondering, how did he get all the way from Baton Rouge to Kansas City? Here is Ajamu Webster. You know what I mean? So that was my beginning with Ajamu. And I want to say that before they introduce themselves and give you some background on them, the best chapter we produced in the National Black United Front that we'll be talking about came out of Kansas City. And Ajamu was chair, but he had a team of people, Leon Dixon being one, and a number of others. And the key, I think, to their success was brilliance. They had some brilliant people, but I think the real key to their success was humility. They had a good team, no big egos up there, one trying to outshine the other. And that's the key to success. If you want a formula for how you can be successful in anything, be humble. And I think that it was the quality of the skills of the team that they had, but it was also their humility. And then Leon the closest person that I had a relationship to in the Black United Front, other than G2 Weusi, was Leon Dixon. And Leon is absolutely brilliant brother. He's going to give you his background in a minute. And one of the things that he's really good at, you'll see, is mathematics, but he's a lover of Black music. And he had in his basement a huge record collection. And that was his therapy. And so he would sit down in there, and he had the best record collection probably anybody in the United States. It would be like the Schoenberg of Black music. You hear me? And you go in there, and you could hear the best music that you could possibly hear. And by the way, Leon's a real good person in terms of understanding what makes people tick. That's Leon. And so I just give you another thing about Leon. When the Million Man March was being prepared, Leon, he just told me this because Conrad had told me what he told Farrakhan, but he never told me where it came from. And Leon said, he called up then the chair of the National Black United Front, Conrad Worrell. He said, Conrad, you know, Farrakhan's getting ready to do this Million Man March. So he's a mathematician, but he also studies people. He said, you know, he don't know how to organize no march. You better get somebody up in there that knows what they're doing. So for your information, you know what I mean? Leon Dixon was the key, and Conrad listened. Conrad sat down with Minister Farrakhan and explained that to him. And then Minister Farrakhan was smart enough to hire a guy named Bob Brown, who was one of the best organizers in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, who set up the organization of the Million Man March. So this is what you call unsung heroes that you don't know nothing about. Some of your best decisions don't come from the people you know about. You hear me? And that was Brother Leon. I said, oh, and then it wasn't surprising when he told me. So that's my background for these two beautiful brothers. So what I'd like to do is, Brother Leon, for you to start and give our viewers an understanding of your background, including your family, your skill set, and your interest in Black education and any other things. Tell them a few things about yourself.
Well, you know, like you mentioned, Charlie Parker with Lincoln High School, and I would also like to tell people I'm also a graduate of Lincoln High School. In fact, 3 generations. My grandmother was in school with James Lyndon Johnson, the guy that's over the Black debaters, and my my uncle's lifelong claim to fame was he was in the high school band with Charlie Parker. So my history goes back a little ways with the public school system. And when I was a freshman in high school, schools were still segregated, and they integrated my sophomore year. And I was 1 block away from the borderline, and I was supposed to go to a predominantly white school. But they grandfathered us and said if we wanted to, we could stay in Lincoln. And I often tell people the best decision I ever made in my life was staying in Lincoln versus going to the predominantly white school. Because you mentioned community. See, like when I was in school, I used to tell people you could name any school in Kansas City, especially Black Kansas City, and somebody could name you 2 or 3 teachers that taught there. I mean, they stayed in the neighborhood. They knew your parents. They knew your relatives and so forth. So like, I remember one of my favorite teachers, Dr. Jeremiah Cameron, and I went to his class and I found out he knew my mother, my father, my uncles and aunties. And I said to myself, well, I better behave because if he said I did it, I did it. But you had a lot of culture background, and see, like that's staying at Lincoln High School is the primary reason I was able to go to Texas Southern University, because I had no idea going to college. But one of the assistant football coach said, Dixon, you're the boy that deserves a break, and I'm gonna try to help you get a scholarship. See, my father passed when I was 6 months old. My mother she passed 3 days after my 14th birthday. So basically, I was an orphan. So like the teachers, they knew all of that, and some of them went to school with my parents, and so they sort of took me under their wings. That's the type of community we had back in the day. And one of my classmates, who I quote often, said, like, when integration came, we got everything we wanted and lost everything we had. That's just an example of that background. Well, when I went to Texas Southern, long story short, I ended up majoring in math, and NASA had a headquarters in Houston, and so like when I was in graduate school working on my, graduate degree in math, I was end up being an apprentice at NASA, and one of the key points is when I was a graduate student, I was also an assistant teacher. For when you're working on your master's, you had to teach classes. And so like those teachers were also assigned to teach what they used to call a clinic, which means the students who had trouble in math, they could go to the clinic and they would get help and support. And I bring it up because that's one of the bases of the Learning Center. Because the Learning Center was sort of modeled after that. See, like when I tutored kids in college, when I started the Learning Center, I was just tutoring school-age kids with people who had graduated from college, like the scientific people, the engineers, the STEM majors, they tutored math and science. The humanities majors tutored reading. And so like that was a way that we could get the people in our community to give back. Because when I came back to Kansas City, I ended up working for the Department of Agriculture, and they had a group, a company they hired to run it. It was Bendix, and that's who hired me. And I remember walking down the halls one day, and I said, I just spent 7 years in school, and nothing I'm doing benefited my community. So I said, this has got to change. So like, while I was at the corporation, many of you probably know Emmanuel Cleaver, who's now in the Congress. Well, he was just another employee. Well, when they had when King got killed, they had demonstrations. So the YMCA wanted to do something to help the Urban Corps. So they hired Cleaver out of Bendix to start an urban services branch. He comes by my house and says, Dixon, I need your help down there because I need somebody to put these white people in check. So I went down there to help him. And so like while he was there, he started a speakers bureau. One of the speakers he brings to town was Abernathy. And Abernathy said, young man, I need you in my business. So he asked me, what do you think? I said, yeah, we can do more with SCLC than we can with the Y. So let's start a chapter of SCLC, Well, I said, now, Cleveland, if you're going to have SCLC chapter, you guys to get some preachers in there. One of the preachers he got was Reverend John Precypes. I think Ajamu remembers him. And he said, Cleveland, so you need to be a minister. So Precypes is the one that encouraged Cleveland to go into the ministry and helped him get a scholarship at one of the ministerial schools. So once he becomes a minister, he ends up with a church. Now, Cleveland was highly popular. All of the young black college graduates were joining his church, and so like, so SCLC was like at his church. So I told him one day, I said, like, we do a whole lot of talking, but we're not doing anything to help the community. We need a program. So I submitted the plans to have a tutorial program, which I called the clinic, where we could tutor math. They say, well, who you going to get to tutor? Because none of them were good enough in math to tutor. I said, don't worry about it. I'm going to get some of these people I work with, engineers and so forth like that. So that's how we started the math program. Now, that same preacher it had a young man that he was tutoring, mentoring named Bill Grace, and Bill Grace started a reading program in his church. So Presipes tells me, say Dixon, you and Grace doing the same thing. Y'all need to hook up. So that's how we hooked up. Now, Grace called his program the W.E.B. Du Bois Reading Program because he had them reading souls of Black folks. That's why he named it after Du Bois. And so when I joined with the math program, we changed it from the Reading Center to the Learning Center.
Okay, now
So
Leon,
got started.
Leon, on this, when we get into the discussion, we're going to get into a discussion of how the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center was set up and all of that. But right now, I just wanted to focus on your background, and we'll get into that part later. Is there anything else, you want to talk about your family or yourself, right now?
Well, basically, I covered, like I say, after my parents deceased, I was raised by my grandmother, and so like I owe her all the credit. She's now an ancestor, but I'll leave it with that.
Okay, very good. And your stuff on integration was more than appropriate. Restate that statement you made about integration, the impact on Black people. State that again.
One of my classmates, he said, like, when integration came, we got everything we wanted and lost everything we had. Because see, as you know, back in the day, like, all the Blacks stayed in the same community. But when integration came, the middle class Blacks left and went out to the suburbs. And so more or less abandoned the urban core. Which created a lot of problems we had now, because the young people, they didn't have any mentors to look up to and mentor them because they all left. Because it was the Black middle class that had the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Little League, and they was mentoring the young kids. But when they left, that mentorship left.
When in fact, the Black middle class and the Black grassroots, the reason for living in a community should be serving your people. But if it was a necessity before, now you get the opportunity to fly out, then you're deserting, the people that gave you everything that you have and turn your back on it. So yeah, that's a good point, along with a lot of other things that happen, like us turning our back on some institutions that we had built.
Well, so like you mentioned that, like when we had the urban core, we had businesses and so forth. Well, see, once integration came, Blacks even abandoned the Black businesses and started spending their money in white businesses.
Yeah, correct. Thinking that white ice is colder. You know what I mean? It's just ice, baby. And in this case, it's your ice. Even if the ice looks the same, it's yours. You own it. But in our case, it's got some soul attached to it, plus a livelihood and prosperity. Well put. Now, Brother Ajamu, how old are you, brother?
I'll be 64 on the 15th of next month.
See, for me, you're a young brother. You're 64, but it's almost 20 years age difference there. 19 to be exact, actually 20. So I'm really proud of you. You know what I mean? Really proud of you, what you've done with your life, your family, your beautiful wife, your children, your profession, but particularly what you've done for Black people. And I know Leon is as well, so give the viewers here some background on yourself.
Thank you. I was born in Los Angeles, California, and grew up there. And my family was, on my mother's side, was very, very close. They never lived. My mother had 7 siblings, and most of them never lived more than 3 blocks from each other. So I grew up in Los Angeles like most people grow up in the country. I could walk a half a block and go to an aunt's house, a cousin's house. Grandmother was 2 blocks down the street. My grandparents had a set of aunt and uncles living right across the street from each other. And so I grew up in Los Angeles, and one of the first major impacts I had on me of the movement was the uprising in Watts. And I remember, and we lived in Watts, so I remember that very, very vividly. And I remember my grandfather one day telling everyone that we had to all lay down on the floor at night because he was concerned of the shootings and things that was taking place. And I had an uncle who was one of my mother's younger brothers, who came on with some souvenirs, from the uprising, and if you're from Los Angeles, you know what that's all about. And so that was on me. That's how I grew up. My mom was the one that, my mom was the one that had a lot to do with getting involved in the movement. But in the late 60s, she would take us to plays and events that took place that at that time were very revolutionary at the Pasla Theater that talked about the movement. So I kind of got engaged in it that way. I had family members who were active in the movement. For a time, my father was in the Nation of Islam, back in the late 50s. He joined the nation. And so I had that kind of upbringing. Wound up going to college at Southern University in Baton Rouge based on a lot of movement activity that was happening that said our people need to be moving to the South. And so some of us took that to heart, and we moved to the South, got married, was down in the South. Brother Dr. Obitashaka came down, as he mentioned, we engaged with us. We brought him down to visit with an organization that we had there on campus. From that, my wife and I, we moved to Kansas City, and we were in Kansas City no more than 3 days before we met Leon Dixon and Bill Samori Grace at an event that the Learning Center was having. And we were looking for our ethnic community, our conscious ethnic community is what we were looking for. Didn't take very long. We got here, met them, and the history of that we're going to be talking about later. I eventually became, under their insistence, and because I lost the coin toss, became the chair of the National Black United Front Kansas City chapter. I lost a 2 out of 3 coin toss with Brother Elton Gumbo, who's still around, and we talk about this all the time, and became the chair. And I was the youngest person in the founder group, and so and stayed chair for 32 years. The organization has since transitioned to new younger leadership, and they're doing an excellent job. So that's about myself. I have been married 44 years. I have 3 children and 6 grandchildren, and everybody's healthy and well.
And talk about your profession, what you majored in, and what kind of business you set up there in Kansas City.
Well, I'm a civil engineer by training with a bachelor's degree from Southern University and a master's degree from the University of Missouri. And I set up an engineering firm after working in corporate America. The inspiration for that was I worked for a firm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, with one of my professors, Mr. Morgan Watson. His firm was Minority Engineers of Louisiana. And he told me that his goal as my mentor was to teach me what I needed to know to run my own business. That was his goal. And Mr. Watson would say, I asked him one time, I said, Mr. Watson, why are you running a firm when, college professors are being snatched off? In the late 70s, they were snatching college engineering professors away from the Black colleges and hiring them in corporate America and doubling their salary. And he told me the reason he's doing that. And I said, why would you stay? And he said, son, I'd rather own my own Volkswagen than chauffeur somebody else's Cadillac. And so he impressed upon me the importance of being in business. And so after about 8 or 9 years of working in corporate America, I started a firm. And the firm is called the Du Bois Consultants. And it's called Du Bois Consultants because we took the name from the Du Bois Learning Center, W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center, because the 4 original founders all tutored in math at the Du Bois Learning Center. So you see the connection here.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to let you know, we ran the business for 33 years. We hired, we had 24 staff members. We have an office in Kansas City and in Wichita, Kansas. 90, with the exception of 2 people, all African, all Black, engineers, designers. And it's a lot to be said about that because that was a lot of contracts with all of our sub-consultants who were Black-owned firms as well. So we did business with Black folks. On October 29th of last year, we sold the firm. to a brother who started with me after 2 years out of school. He's come and stayed with me for 13 years, and he came back and took charge of the firm. And so I'm officially graduated from owning a firm, and we moved on to other things. So that's what I am. I am a structural engineer by training, professional engineer, and own the business, the engineering firm, for 33 years, which is still in Black hands and still moving forward.
And he's got a master's in engineering. So he's a builder in more than one way. And notice he didn't even mention that. That's a humility right there. You know what I mean? So both of these guys, one is a mathematician. Leon, how far are you away from, you could have got a PhD in mathematics. How many units away from that were you from getting a PhD in mathematics?
Well, I finished all the courses in math, and I went to the University of Missouri, Kansas. I went to the University of Iowa first, but illness took me away from it. Like, as you know, I walk with the cane and so forth. And then in my later years, I decided to try to finish. So I went to UMKC and I finished all the coursework, but I had a hard time passing the master's exams. And one of my teachers told me, he said, like, he thinks that my advisors and them rigged the exam. And one friend of mine told me, he said, he was talking to a friend of his, he said, like, well, I got a friend that's working on a PhD in math. The guy said, if he finishes, I want to meet him, because UMKC ain't gonna get no math, no PhD, no black person in math, And so, like, that always stuck with me. But I finished all the coursework. I just didn't pass the exams. I wasn't smart enough to pass the exam.
Yeah, you weren't smart enough to answer questions that couldn't be answered, given only to you. Right? Yeah, so I'm stressing this to stress something else. This thing of excellence, this is part of what's being manifested here on many different levels. But the main thing is both of these brothers have dedicated their lives to Black folks. And because their heads are wrapped on right. This show, I think it was the third show, I went into a definition of power. And that definition of power was basically that power is our thoughts that make us who we are. And our highest thoughts enable us to uncover cosmic truths that lead to bringing harmony to the cosmos. That would be describing a George Washington Carver on that end. But for everyday people, everybody, your thoughts make who you are. These two brothers here have had the thoughts of loving themselves and loving their people, and the thoughts that they could do what they could do, including, among other things, building the best after school or supplementary school in the United States, and providing the best example of Blacks running a school of over 1,000 students inside the public school system because they thought they could. And of course, they had the skills to do it. Man, get this straight. Just thinking you could be great ain't enough. Muhammad Ali could say, I am the greatest, and he had never got in a ring, never knocked anybody out. He's just talking snuff. You know what I mean? But if you got the foundation, then, you can do the graduation to the higher ranks. And so that's what they manifest. So what I want to get into right now is really the basis, the organizational basis for this, because this is the fifth in a series dealing with power, in this case, Black power. And so what I want to deal with at this point is the organizational foundation on which these two, particularly the second move in the public schools, could be launched, because the Bois Learning Center preceded the Black United Front. But in the case of the Kansas City public school model, it grew out of an initiative in the Black United Front. So what I wanted to do was get into a discussion briefly, particularly for the benefit of younger viewers and some people who may not know the whole history, and then some who know part of it, the history of one of the most important organizations to come out of the Black nation in the United States in the 80s, the National Black United Front. And so I want to start off with just a few things to give you a little background, and then Leon and Ajamu are going to talk about their views of the National Black United Front. There were a number of founders of the Black United Front, National Black United Front. W.E.B, who was a field marshal, he was the one who was the key person in setting it up. Reverend Herbert Daughtry, who was the first national chair of the Black United Front, and as I pointed out before, Tupac Shakur's minister, and had served time in prison 2 times before he got his act together, and is a very beautiful brother. He's in his 90s now and in good shape. He's a vegetarian. A lot of people in his family had bad hearts. He decided to get off meat. That kept him, fit and everything else. So he was the second founder of NBUF. The third was Ron Herndon, who played a very important part in the educational movement. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the fourth was myself. Now, G2 and I are buddies, G2 Most people don't know this about G2. And I did not know this until close to the end of his life, and should have known this. Conrad didn't, because when he was writing the book on the history, Conrad Worrell, who became national chair of the Black United Front and served in that position for a long time after Reverend Herbert Daughtry, he was writing a history on the National Black United Front. And I asked him a few years before he passed, I said, did you know that G2's skills were shaped by CORE, Congress of Racial Equality? Now, that's my base, CORE. And I led the Black nationalist wing in CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and one of our most important chapters came from Brooklyn CORE. Well, G2 was not active in Brooklyn CORE. So and we were good friends from 72. I never asked him about CORE's influence on him. But towards the end, I came to realize it. G2 told me, he said, I learned how to organize by sitting in CORE's office and learning basic organizing skills. And then he played a key role, G2 in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, which was an effort to gain control of the schools in Ocean Hill, Brownsville. And he was a public school teacher there. And so he made the comment later, he said, no CORE, no Ocean Hill, Brownsville. CORE produced the most complex organizers in the Black freedom movement because we organized across the country, north, south, east, and west, whereas SNCC and CORE organized in the south. The Southern movement produced the greatest achievements in terms of breaking up legal apartheid. That's the big deal. No Northern movement without the Southern movement. But the fact of the matter is, CORE was really crucial in that, and it played a big role in shaping G2's skills. I first met G2 in 1972, and I was running an organization parallel to his. He was running the East, which had an independent Black school called Uhuru Sasa. I was running Pan-African People's Organization that had an independent school called Afrikan Children's Advanced Learning Center. He had a newsletter called Black News. We put out a newspaper called The African Awakener. He sent people to Guyana to do work. We sent people to Africa to do work. His organization was a block away from a place called Fulton Street, and our organization was on Fulton Street. You hear me? We're both born 1939, and I accidentally introduced him to his second wife, Angela Weusi, who said that she gained her consciousness to be able to handle G2 from attending our meetings. And she was a close friend of my first wife, Anasa Tashaka. So this is destiny. So we were buddies. And so when things break down in the 70s, and we had African Liberation Support Committee, Congress of African People, and the Black Political Assembly that Amiri Baraka led, over 10,000 people meeting, those things imploded by the late 70s. And G2 was hurt by it. And he would often send his members to the Black Political Assembly, and the instruction he gave them was vote the way Baraka voted. Well, when Baraka then shifts to a Maoist position, a Marxist position, and I have a lot of respect for Baraka. Even when he shifted, I knew this is just Baraka. I mean, he wasn't selling out. This is Baraka. He goes to extremes and then evens out. And by the time he evens out, the groups have fallen apart. And so after that happened, I'm telling G2, we need to form a Black United Front, National Black United Front. I'm chairing Pan-African People's Organization and a group called the Pan-African Secretariat. G2 says no, and I could understand why, because he had been in the middle of blow up. He was disappointed. He had left the East now, and so at some point he decides to get engaged in forming the National Black United Front. And I'm not saying I'm the one that persuaded him. And he was the pivotal person in terms of organizing it, because he was on the East Coast. He had a lot of contacts with a lot of groups, and he understood Black psychology quite well. G2 did. And so we then began working on forming the National Black United Front. And so a series of meetings were held to plan for the organization of the National Black United Front. One was a meeting on COINTELPRO. I didn't attend that meeting. G2 did. And then there was a meeting in 1979 in Brooklyn, New York, that G2 convened. Maulana Karinga attended. Askia Muhammad Toure attended. I did, and others. I won't give you some of the colorful stuff that happened there, but I'm going to tell you it was quite colorful. That's for another time. So then in 1980, January 25th and 26th of 1980, meetings were held at Roberts Motel in Chicago. And at that meeting, various groups that I'll mention in a minute gathered to discuss the formation of the National Black United Front. And this material I'm going through right here comes from a book that I wrote specifically coming out of the formation of NBUF, called Strategies and Tactics for Building a Mass-Based Black United Front. Ajamu, did you ever read this?
No, I don't think I've seen that.
Yeah, this was the founding document for NBUF. It's a 99-page document. It took me 2 weeks to write, and it was an effort to save NBUF, because in the formation, a few things happened. And so this document was designed to cool out some stuff inside of NBUF. So the meeting that occurs January 25th through 26th, 1980, came out of some decisions coming from the Black United Front in Brooklyn, the Black United Front in Philadelphia, Black United Front in Portland, Black United Front in Mississippi, and Black United Front in Cairo, Illinois. All of these groupings, under the leadership of our organizing group, had decided to build a national organization. And so what happens January 25th through 26th, 1980, we had the alphabet soup of Black nationalists and radical organizations meeting at Roberts Motel. So we had included in this meeting, these are all of them, All African People's Revolutionary Party. Bob Brown represented All African People's Revolutionary Party. The African People's Socialist Party. The Kawaiti Groundwork Committee, Maulana Karinga representing them at the first meeting, and one of his representatives at a subsequent meeting. The Black United Front from Cairo, Illinois. The Council for Independent Black Institutions. The Institute for Positive Education, which Haki Marabuti was in charge of. The Republic of New Africa, with its leader represented. Adiania in New Orleans, Louisiana, the Pan-African Secretariat that I chaired that had chapters in different parts of the country, the Communiversity of Chicago with Anderson Thompson representing them. And by the way, Conrad was driving us around at this meeting. And Conrad was running around saying, what do you think of this? What do you, typical suspicious Chicago. What do you think of this? Pulling off a meeting in Chicago was a big deal because it's hard to bring anything into Chicago and get away with it if you're not from Chicago. Then also represented was Amiri Baraka, who came in the second meeting. And then some of the people that attended, Reverend Herbert Dowtry, G2 Weusi. G2 was the convener, Dr. Maulana Karenga, Reverend Charles Cohen, Kofi Lamote, who's an educator, Brother Haki Marabuti, Lewis Myers, who was a Black movement attorney, Amari Obadelli, who represented the Republic of New Africa, a beautiful brother who passed a few years ago, Tayari Kwa Salam, myself, Bob Brown, a brother named Akili Jagas, Joseph Waller, and Anderson Thompson. So this is the kickoff for the planning for the National Black United Front. Its convention occurs Thursday through Sunday, January 26th through 29th, 1980. What you need to understand is these were the key organizations representing militant Black organizations around the United States who are carrying out struggles in different parts of the country against police brutality. And in the case of Portland, Oregon, against racism in the public schools. So this occurs, the formation of MBUF occurs at the time of the election of Ronald Reagan, 1980. It occurs at a time in which the economy is contracting, in which poverty is growing in America, and the cutbacks, serious cutbacks on various programs for Blacks and poor. And it's out of this that NBUF emerges as a national organization in its first convention held in 1980 in Brooklyn, New York. And it goes on to organize and do some very important things in the Black liberation movement, with Reverend Herbert Dowtry serving as its first chair, and G2 Weusi serving as like field marshal. He was administrator for the organization in that beginning. So I want to give people a little background because this is the launching pad for the Afrikan Centered Educational movement, what happens in KC. And while the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center was there before, it plays a very important role itself in stabilizing and strengthening and giving some direction to the Afrikan Centered Educational movement inside the Black United Front. So Leon and Ajamu, what's your impressions of the significance of MBUF as a national organization, as well as in Kansas City, Missouri?
Well, the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center was a founding member of the Kansas City chapter of the National Black United Front and brought us in. I was at that time tutoring at the Learning Center with Leon Dixon, Bill Grace, and the other team. It was a great team that we had there. But we came in to the National Black United Front that way. So just simply saying, there would have been no Afrikan Centered Education in Kansas City without the National Black United Front, without the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center. It just would not have happened. So the significance of that is profound. So the National Black United Front is still very, very active here in Kansas City and on the cutting edge of the issues of reparations, on the issue of rites of passage, on the issues of public education, on the whole anti-police brutality, police violence movement, which is going on here, even on racism within the fire department. So we have all of those issues going on, and the National Black United Front is part of that. Our chair is Brother Talib Bawakil, and he is part of a standing committee of organizations that we have in Kansas City that work together on these issues that fight for our people, in addition to being the head of the INABUF. So those are my comments on the significance of the National Black United Front on the movement that we have here in Kansas City.
Leon, what's your view of the significance of the National Black United Front, generally, nationally, and specifically for Kansas City?
Well, one of the things I point out about the National Black United Front, like we point out, is stimulated from the Learning Center. But let me say this right quick. One of the key benefits of the Learning Center is this diversity of talent. Most organizations have good people in it, but they kind of all have the same background. Like the National Association of Engineers, the National Association of Journalists, and so forth. But the Learning Center has a diversity of talent. And in our geometry classes, we had the civil engineers. That's where Ajamu worked. And one guy said, y'all need to start a business, and that's how that started. But you see, it's that diversity of talent that's in the Black United Front. You have people from various backgrounds, and that's where if everybody's speaking the same language, there's no new thoughts coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And see, so you have to learn how to play the hand that you've been dealt, and that's what I credit the Black United Front with doing: play the hand that you've been dealt. And so so we take advantages of the various talents that's in our community and move forward to benefit our community. That's one of the main things I would say about the National Black United Front, nationally and locally.
Yeah.
That's a good observation, a real good observation. And key to that is when you have humility among the people who make up the organization, then they'll allow each of these voices that bring in kind of like a different sound in a band, you know what I mean, to play. And then what'll come up with out of that is some beautiful music. And so, yeah, that is really key. And I think within INBUF nationally, and I think in your chapter locally, you had that as well as in the Learning Center. And I would say most groups have that. Most groups, if you really look at it, particularly community groups, have a diversity of talent. The question is, how do you use it? And are you open to what people have to say? Because when people are coming in with ideas, be open. It's like Coltrane used to say, he said he would listen to the worst musician because he could do something he couldn't do, you know what I mean? And draw from it. So I think that that's a real strength. And I think that was a strength of INBUF as an organization. That's a good observation. Now, getting into the African Centered Educational movement, between 1985 and 1988, we had a debate within INBUF over whether or not we should pursue an African-centered educational movement. And this debate was spurred by the completion of the African American baseline essays in Portland, Oregon. And I think we really have to note this. It was the Portland chapter of the Black United Front that brought in a movement around African-centered education through their successful boycott of the public schools in 1980 under Ron Herndon. And he had led a group called the Black Educational Center. So the movement to boycott the public schools and to get a quality curriculum for Black students and an African-centered curriculum sprung out of independent Black school. You know what I mean? Just as you've got here, the W.E.B. the Bois Learning Center serving as a stable foundation for INBUF and also, for generating a lot of stuff around Black education. And so that was 85% effective. And that leads to Asa Hilliard being brought in as the curriculum consultant. And then from 1980 to 1984, shaping the African American baseline essays that we talked about last week. So what happens in 83, I'm elected national vice chair. In 84, I believe it's when Conrad was elected national chair. And I'm looking at one thing. We have a national organization, but we don't have a national program. And that had been a problem for a while. But we had local groups that were doing different things, which was good. But we needed a national program. And so when this thing comes out of the African American baseline essays, comes out of Portland, I started to think. I said, okay, how would this fit in Buff? And I started looking at it. Okay, we got Conrad. He's an educator. We got G2 he's a public school teacher. You know, you got me. We run an independent Black school. I teach at a university. We've got the W.E.B, the Bois Learning Center in Kansas City. And I just started, and Ron Herndon, who comes out of the independent Black school movement and then fosters this Afrikan Centered Educational movement. I said, the natural match for this is NBUF. NBUF can make this thing work. It fits like a glove on a hand or a good set of shoes on your feet. And so I remember in 1984, we had a Central Committee meeting in Kansas City, Missouri. And you, Leon, was sitting right next to me. And I came in prepared with shotguns to argue. We need to have this African-centered educational movement. I put forward my best arguments. You know what I mean? They were the most impassioned set of arguments I made in MBUF, period. You know what I mean? And so we had a brother, Kofi Lamotep, who was head of CB, Council for Independent Black Institutions. This is a federation of independent Black schools set up by G2 Notice his name again. You hear me? And when I get through, Kofi says, well, you know, we ain't been able to get NBUF involved in independent education. How are we going to get them involved in the public school? And blah, blah, blah. So this got shot down. And so I said, I got to go back to Oakland and do something about this. So we organized Buffer, Black United Front for Educational Reform, with a brother named Oscar Wright, who's a multimillionaire. He's about 98 years old now, come out of Mississippi. Tough brother, nice brother too. Inside man on education in Oakland, knew everybody in the public school system that ran anything or teachers or whatever. So we formed this group and we took over McClymonds junior high school, recruited the principal and got Wade Nobles on board. And Wade helped us with the strategy. He's a good inside strategist. What I mean is system strategy. Wade knows how to get money. And he's got the mindset of thinking like the opponent and thinking like you. So we concocted a strategy, took over that school and put Wade in, I think for 4 years, about $400,000 a year to set up an African Centered curriculum. So when I come to the National NBUF Convention in 1998, and by the way, when I work out at the Y, I have the T-shirt that came out of the NBUF Convention, two of them, one's red, one's black and white. And it's got a decade of struggle on it, something like that. And when I work out, I wear that all the time. You know what I mean? And so at this point, we come in now with a product and we got it. Conrad jumps on board. Everybody else jumps on board. So this is when we make the decision to start the movement for Afrikan Centered Education. So Ajamu and Leon, talk about what that movement meant for you, why you all took it up in Kansas City.
Well, Kansas City was in a unique circumstance. We were going through a desegregation process that was federal court controlled. And we saw in what was happening in Kansas City, the whole spin around desegregation was to attract white students back into the Kansas City schools. And the district was spending millions of dollars just on transportation, sending buses and cabs to the white suburbs to bring white students back to Kansas City. The names of the schools were being changed. The curriculum that was put in place was Latin, grammar, Greek, French, immersion, Latin schools that modeled Catholic schools, all of that, and nothing. We said for the adjudicated victims of slavery and segregation, there was no theme on the table for us. And so we saw a major challenge, but a major opportunity when it came to African Centered Education to go in this environment where they were creating culturally based schools for white people that would attract them back, and for our children to sit there and be made to feel worse about who they are. It was a great opportunity for us to take what was done in Portland, the Portland Baseline Essays, mobilize our community, and go in and fight for a culturally relevant school. And at that time, everybody was talking about multicultural education. And it was through NBUF that we began to push the whole concept of African Centered Education as a component of the multicultural thrust. So that's where it came for us, Brother Oba. It was an opportunity for us to grab resources that came out of Portland, Oregon, the scholarship associated with that, and then present that as a model and a solution to deal with the issues that confronted us.
Let me add this. See, like when they started that multicultural thing that Ajamu was talking about, they had like a Mexican school, a Chinese school. So Ajamu said, well, what about us? They said, we don't have anybody know how to do African Centered School. We said, well, we know how to do it. And that's what gave rise to the African Centered School. One of the things that gave rise to African Centered School in Kansas City, because they just was kicking us to the curb. And so Ajamu and them said, no, we need to have something about our culture. And so they had to step up and do it because nobody else could.
Mm-hmm. Now that's smart, because what you're doing is fitting into your opponent's policy yourself. That, by the way, is called the perfect strategy, because when your policy matches your enemy's policy, you can make them fall. You know what I mean? So that was a accidental circumstance that presented itself, and you took advantage of it.
We did indeed.
I often use expressions. We have to learn how to play cultural karate.
Yeah. Well put. And since you got a black belt here, he knows something about that. Namo failed to mention the fact that he got a black belt in karate. I think he said 4th degree, is it, or 5th?
5th degree.
5th degree. Yeah, he's been doing it a long time. You know what I mean? Modest brother. He doesn't cite these little things here. A good martial artist generally doesn't anyway. Now, at the time of this movement towards African-centered education, you had a thing going on with Black scholars in the U.S., African-centered scholars. Y'all want to talk a little bit about what was happening with our scholars at this time and how they were impacting our communities?
Well, absolutely. And it was through our connection with NBUF that we had relationships with scholars. So, for example, when we were struggling with the Kansas City School District, and later on, I'll get into more details about that, we were able to call on some of the national scholars to give us some backup and support. One example, the school, Southeast High School, which eventually became one of our African-centered schools, was themed with a health science profession as their theme. So what we did was, and this was one of NBUF members, myself, Dr. Linwood Tahi, we went out, contacted Dr. Charles Finch and said, Dr. Finch, can you come in and help us develop an African-centered theme around health sciences? And he said, absolutely. He came in, developed a baseline essays around that. And then we were able to go in and fight with the administration and the school board to say, why would we not have our history and contributions to health science as part of this theme? So that was one way. The other one was Dr. Asa Hilliard himself, since he was involved with the baseline essays. When we were able to push the needle to get permission to do the first African-centered elementary school, he immediately jumped on board to support that effort. So the scholarship was there. The baseline essays provided the scholarship. We had relationship with the scholars that come in and speak to the issue. And then we were able to drive the point home through the community organizing that we were able to do to get community and parents and folks to demand that these things take place.
Leon, you have any comments on that in terms of the African Centered Scholars and the impact they were having at that time?
Yeah, one I wanted to add, see, like when you look at the in-buff chapters, if I'm not mistaken, Kansas City is the only chapter that I know of that had people with technical backgrounds in the leadership, mainly Ajamu and myself. So when I saw the African Centered curriculum, my interest was in the science and math, the science and math part of it, you know. And so given my background in math, you know, I wanted to add in there the contribution that Black people historically played in introducing to the world science and mathematics. When you put your culture component in there, because most schools, especially this Eurocentric type schools, they have everything coming from the Eurocentric point of view, and our kids don't realize the role we played in introducing education in general, math and science in particular, to the world culture. So you have to include that into the programs as well. You know, that I never will forget. I had this one young lady who was a junior in high school. She never heard of Langston Hughes. And so I had her read the poem, The Negro Speaks a River. And she read that line about I have known river. She said, well, Black people don't know it like, and she mentioned the Nile River. Said, well, Black people back there. So I had to give her a whole lecture on the role that the Black people played, you know, in to help and develop ancient Egypt. And like when I teach kids geometry, I let them know where the word geometry comes from. So like they came from the Egyptians studying the Greeks studying the Egyptians navigating the land and so forth. And so like he referred to it as measuring earth. That's where the word geometry comes from. Geo, earth, metry, measure. And so I told him, I said, there are no people back there look just like you.
Yeah, and geometry was invented in Kemet when the Nile flooded and
right.
used land, so you had to redistribute it, and geometry was set up as the mathematical system so that people could get a proper redistribution of land. You know what I mean? But again, yeah.
And see, Thales, who was a Greek, he came and saw them doing that and was fascinated. That's why he called it geometry. And most people don't realize, but I also point this out, Pythagoras was one of his number one proteges, and he encourages Pythagoras to go to Egypt and study, which he did for 20-some years. And so he goes back to Greece and talk about Pythagorean theorem now, but they don't talk about how he learned all that stuff from Africans.
Exactly. And he was the longest of the students that attended the mystery systems coming from Greece to Kemet, the longest. And the one that was most faithful to the teachings he learned, one of which was not to write it down, you know what I mean? Because it was a mystery. And then he was the biggest influence on Plato, bigger than Socrates, direct Kemetic influence. Yeah, last week we were talking about how this African-centered cultural renaissance and then the African-centered educational movement was spearheaded by African scholars. Now, the Black United Front is a field arm that helped organize this. But the key point is the scholars come forward and begin to put forward ideas digging into the deep well of African history centered around ancient Kemet, but Africa in general and African American history and culture. And it provides a basis for an explosion in the Black community. Because at this time, Black communities are hitting under a heavy attack. Reaganism is hitting us. Redevelopment is breaking up communities. Corporations are taking jobs out of the country. Black families are being eroded at a faster pace than at any point in our history. So that this begins to provide some answers for Black people at the grassroots level. One area that this movement affects is rap. Ajamu, you got any impressions on what was happening with the rap movement at this point?
Like just about everything else, that was significant in our culture, it was turning towards what the scholars was talking about in terms of the history that has been erased or stolen, and bringing that back into the popular culture. The rap music at that time was African centered. A lot of the greatest rap that came at that time wasn't, because those rappers were in touch with the scholars. And we use that because rap was very much something that the young people were gravitating to during that time, and they could listen to that information and it would inspire them. So right here in Kansas City, give me an example. We had issues where, because the desegregation program was so focused on making sure white students came in, that principals started making it illegal in their schools to celebrate Black History Month and to celebrate Dr. King's birthday. Now, this is in the early 90s. Now, this sounds far-fetched to folks, but it was the students, high school students, who were inspired by what they were listening to that caused them to start taking over high schools. And in fact, they took over 3 high schools. One of them, when they took over, Bill Gray's brother Samoy, one of the founders of Learning Center, he was accused of organizing the students for the takeover. And it was one of those classic situations because of his reputation. They figured, you work with young people. If they're taking over schools around something they're learning about Black history and culture, you must be responsible for it. And it was one of those classic, well, I didn't start it, but let me go down there and see what's going on. So it was through hip hop that our young people were getting inspired. And what was going on at the Learning Center and in Afrikan Centered Education is we had institutions for those inspired young people to tap into.
Leon, you got any more to add to that?
Well, Ajamu mentioned about how early rap was culturally centered, and I often tell people, you know, one of the first rappers back there was KRS-One. Mm-hmm. And I say, well, what does that mean? So they don't know. I say, KRS, knowledge reigns supreme. Mm-hmm. ONE, over nearly everyone. So that's why he named himself that. KRS-One, knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everyone.
Mm-hmm. Boogie Down Productions, they use my book, Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by Choice Between Two Cultures. Public Enemy was crucial, and they've got a background with the Black Panther Party, because the head of Public Enemy's mother was in the Black Panther Party. So there is a real effect of the African-centered thrust on the rappers, and that has a big effect on the youth.
Look at Tupac. Don't you got to give him his props.
Yeah. He had real influence coming out of the Black Panther Party, and was very conscious and a great artist, magnificent artist. In fact, the hip hop generation, Tupac is to them as Malcolm is to our generation. Of course,
what was that group he was singing with before he broke off? It was a group out there in California. Tupac was like the lead singer in it, and he split off and started his own, individual stuff, But it was a group. I can't think of the name of it now.
At the same time, the African-centered movement, centered in Kemet, but around ancient African and African American history, affects the Black church. And so, and this is the key thing. When you have a movement, it hits all sectors. And so in the Black church, you have a African-centered church movement. And Reverend Jeremiah Wright is considered to be one of the leaders of that movement, who, interestingly enough, is where, Barack Obama went to church and then got caught in crossfire when he ran for president. But there were a series of African-centered churches around the country drawing from this. When we moved to African-centered studies at San Francisco State, one of the key people in our faculty is Reverend J. Alfred Smith Jr., who comes from Allen Temple Church, which is a Black church that is one of the best churches in the country. It has housing for Black people, Family Life Center, a huge Family Life Center you go into the church, Jesus is Black. And they played a big part in affecting the shift from Black studies to African centered studies, bringing in the church component. But this is around the country. You know what I mean? I did a tour of the South in 1990 by car and ran into a Black church in Memphis, Tennessee, Greater Romani Church. They had 500 members. 3 years later, I hook up with that church. They got 15,000 members. And the leader of that church, Reverend Bill Atkins, who was a historian and also a person who was a radio personality, was running the church for no pay and is African centered. You know what I mean? And I just talked to him 2 weeks ago because we hadn't been in conversation for a while. And in fact, there's a show where you see me. It was on the introduction of the Mother Principle in 1995 at his church, talking to Kwame Ture, who had attended that particular meeting that he called of the nationalist community, about 300 Black folks in Memphis. So this African-centered movement affected the Black church. Y'all got any comments on that? You got any knowledge of this?
See, like, I remember hearing Benjamin Mays on television one time. I think it's maybe back in the 80s on public television. And he was saying that one of the main reasons Blacks could read and write were due to two institutions, the Black church and the Black college. You know, and see, like, and Du Bois points out when slavery was over with, Blacks were about like 5% literate. By about 1910, 1920, we were about like 70% literate. And he said, nobody else in history had done that before we did it. Mm-hmm. And like I say, he credits two institutions, the Black church and the Black college. Now, speaking of the Black church, I remember telling a minister one time that the Learning Center was modeled after the Black church. I said, y'all don't teach Sunday school teachers. Y'all don't pay Sunday school teachers. We don't pay Saturday school teachers.
Hey, listeners, listening to that one.
Yeah, because see, like, and I said, like, I think it was, I remember reading an article by Nikki Giovanni. She said, we need to learn how to play the hand we've been dealt. You know, he said, now, when you walk through our community, you see a lot of buildings that we own. And one of the primary ones is Black churches. So she said, we can do more than with these Black churches, just going to church on Sunday mornings. We can use those same Sunday school classes to teach Saturday school classes. Mm-hmm. And all you got to do is find a relevant and conscious minister and congregation and ask them, can we use your Sunday school to teach Saturday school? And in most cities, we have some conscious churches and pastors and so forth who'll be willing to let you use their facilities to do that. Mm-hmm. And so the Learning Center started, like I said before, in churches. Mm-hmm. That's where we were tutoring our kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of you all listening right now who have become so African-centered that you think the Black church is just out, no good, blah, blah. And yeah, there are some that are out. No good, that might fit for some. But the reality is, as Brother Leon is pointing out, it's a one institution we own other than Black family, you know what I mean? And some Black businesses, but it's a Black church. But it also houses the essence of our culture. We dropped our culture into what became the Black church. And I keep saying this, not on the plantation. We didn't embrace Christianity until after slavery on our own terms. And it's one of the most African institutions we have, even though we don't know it's African. You hear me? Huh?
And see, that was the main places where Blacks could go and congregate and interact. And most people think of Black church, they think like on Sundays, but like, where do we have our Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts? Where do we have all our organizations where we work with our young people and so forth, and community activities and so forth? They meet in our churches. Mm-hmm. You know, and I would say they were much more than just going there and worship, you know. And like I often quote Claire Ward, the gospel singer. She had a song that I often quote, "My soul looks back and wonders how I got over." Mm-hmm. You know, And when I do my lot of speeches and so forth, I fall back on it. That's my main theme, to explain to our community how we got over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And in essence, how did we get over? There's a lot of reasons, but I would put it on one word: spirit. Spirit, brother, because it's a spirit that lies within each of us. The Black church manifests it in terms of, that's the biggest thing we dropped into what we called the Black church was voodoo, which was the stuff we were practicing on the plantation. And when you get down to the revival that occurs that leads to the Pentecostal church, what is that? Again, the spirit. You hear me? What's the essence of Kemet? It's the spirit. You hear me? It's a spirit-based civilization. And Ella Baker, she made this point. She said, the Black church is the carrier of the aesthetics of the Black community. Beauty. You hear me? Now, some of these preachers who are up there making these beautiful sermons, you're wondering what they're talking about. You hear me? Some of them talking about money. And Reverend Dollar has got his helicopter, you know what I mean? I guess with a vault in it or something. But the majority of that, what you see in the Black church, that's beauty. Where do our best singers come from? The Black church. Where do our best speakers come from? The Black church. You understand?
Debaters, all of that.
Huh?
Debaters, you know.
Yeah. It's true. It's declined now because a lot of Black youth ain't in the church no more. You know what I mean?
Well, integration. We lost everything we had.
Yeah, and also because the church needs to update itself to be more in tune with this younger generation. And there's a significant decline of attendance by young sisters, but the majority of sisters still go to church. Church, you hear me? And I ain't no Christian. I keep pointing this out. I'm not pushing anybody's religion, but I'm just stating facts. And by the way, you can't be a good organizer in the Black community unless you are able to organize in the Black church. If you can't do that, then you're in kindergarten when it comes to organizing. You hear me? Kindergarten. And some of our best organizations got isolated because they didn't hook up with the Black church. Big mistake.
You was missing the Million Man March, and when I talked to Conrad, I said, like, Farrakhan can't even organize Black ministers. So he don't have a good relationship with Black ministers. So that's one reason why, one of the reasons I used for Conrad, I argued for Conrad to get involved to help organize the Million Man March. You need to have somebody that can work with the Black community, especially the Black ministers, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But, you know, interestingly enough, there's some key big mega churches that will allow Farrakhan to get up on Sunday and preach. You know, they had a 10,000 member Black church, AME church in Baltimore, Maryland. Farrakhan spoke there regularly. I spoke there once, so did Asa Hilliard. You know, the minister there, who's now a bishop in the AME church, was a hell of a reader, read all the time. But Farrakhan would be able to get up in the pulpit on Sunday. Now, you know, that ain't happening in too many churches. But the point is, the minister was conscious enough to realize he had something to say. Put him up there. You know
well, that shows you how we evolve over time, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like I often quote this all the time. One of C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father, you know, he was outstanding preacher. In fact, he was a mentor for King, you know, back in the day. And one of his daughters, it wasn't Aretha, but one of his other daughters says his most iconic sermon was a sermon about the eagle stirs his nest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, yeah. and that's a study, that's a sermon that needs to be studied. And like the classic thing is, the eagle stirs his nest, his eggs ends up down there with chicken, and the chicken hatches, and he didn't even realize he think he's a chicken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the moral of the story is, Black people in America like eagles in the barnyard. We don't know we eagles. We thinking we around there trying to be good chickens.
Last week I was talking about the father of gospel blues, Thomas Dorsey, and how when he introduced gospel sound, got it mixed in with the blues because he was a blues player for Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey. Then what he was able to do in training Mahalia Jackson and James Cleveland, bring them into the Black church. And what happened is they raised the spirit. They were going back to what was happening in the plantation. And the example that a lot of Black people give is the exact one you gave, Leon. The eagle stirs his nest. He said, prior to this brother coming into the Black church with this spiritual blues, he said, we were like chickens, people acting like chickens when in fact our parents were eagles. And it's when this Dorsey sound comes in that this chicken, this eaglet, who's running in the barnyard thinking that he's a chicken, begins to see his mother fly. And in the case of the Black church, they hear these sounds of Africa, which is the spiritual blues. And they said, suddenly they started flapping their wings. And then suddenly they started flying. And he said, suddenly they realized they weren't chickens. They were eagles flying over the barnyard. You know what I mean? And that's literally what happens with the Afrikan Centered movement. You know what I mean? The Afrikan Centered movement is getting us to realize we ain't no Americans, you're Africans, brothers, sisters. You know what I mean? Open your eyes up. If you want to call yourself African American, that's fine, but put African on it. You hear me? And your wings are going to fly. You're going to go high. You know what I mean? So that was a real good example. And then, of course, during this time, you had rites of passage programs, and you had a heavy amount of young Blacks and older Blacks reading. Over 179 million books written by Black authors were bought in the early 1990s, 1 year, 179 million. You hear me? Black people.
Before we leave the music, see, like I also want to point out how we had coded messages in a lot of our music.
Right.
When we would sing songs. You know, like the master thought we was out there shucking and jiving, you know, and we were singing these songs with messages in it. Right. Like if we want to slip off and have a meeting, we start singing that song, gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Mm-hmm. Which means that's where we're gonna go and have our meeting, down by the riverside. And then the next morning, you know, like the house slave, she would walk around and the master, they didn't know what, so she just start singing the song, way down yonder by myself, and didn't hear nobody pray, meaning we got over. Mm-hmm. But Harriet Tubman wanted to leave. She wanted to tell her sister who was up in the, she was in the kitchen with the mistress, so she couldn't tell her. So she started singing that song in that great getting up morning, fare thee well, fare thee well. Mm-hmm. So I'm getting ready to split.
Mm-hmm. I've got a few comments on the side here, Brother Shabazz. The influence of the Black church has declined significantly. And he also says, but we are collaborating with a progressive Black minister here in our small town, you know? And and then Brother Cinnabar makes this comment here that mad respect for the Black church with great accolades, but I know the God talk theology can be a double-edged sword. But if used correctly, your God talk can be used towards revolutionary ends, you know? So people are talking both sides. Yeah, it cuts both ways. So what we're doing here is just dealing with the background of what's going on in Black communities when this African-centered cultural renaissance is being launched, and then out of it comes the African-centered educational movement. And NBUF decides the National Black United Front, to adopt the World Afrocentric Educational Plan that I talked about last week. This document was written in 1988, and it's got a number of platforms, and the key ones were around supporting and expanding independent Black schools, getting curriculum inside the public schools, and also dealing with supplementary education or independent education in after-school programs, and then rites of passage, study groups, and other things. And so one of the things we did when we made the move on Afrikan Centered Education is that we designated the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center as the model for Afrikan Centered Education at the supplementary school level. And we wrote this little booklet here, Leon and I, and it's entitled NBUF Educational Plan, Public School Program, and the Kansas City Learning Center Model by Leon Dixon. So what we're going to get into right now is a two-part discussion. We're going to start with Leon. He's going to talk about what was involved in setting up the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center. And then Ajamu Webster is going to get into the Afrikan Centered Educational movement at the public school level at Kansas City. And we've already discussed how you all got to know each other. So Brother Leon Dixon is co-founder of the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center. And he also is the author of a very important book that people should get, The Future in Our Hands. And the subtitle is Institution Building for Supplementary Education, a discourse on the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center by Leon Dixon Jr. This is not only a manual for how to set up independent Black supplementary schools, but it's a piece of art because there's a lot of history in here, science in here. It's a lot of stuff about Black folks in here. This is a magnificently written piece. Where can people get this book, Leon? How can they get it?
Well, you probably have to contact somebody in the Kansas City chapter, National Black United Front. We could, we could send it off to you, or you could contact the Du Bois Learning Center. But most of the people on this call would probably be better off by contacting somebody in the Kansas City chapter.
Okay, what'll happen is I'll get the information from Ajamu, and then we'll post it on our site, and then people can order it through you, but they'll know how to do it. And so people should check this out and look at it. Now, Leon, in your book, you talk about a very important notion, which is paradigm or model, and you're using this in the context of education and the way in which the meaning of paradigm or model impacts our idea of Black education. And you centered it in looking at African American culture on the importance of the value for freedom. And then you make a quote from Du Bois where he stated that had it not been for the Negro school and college, the Negro would have been driven back to slavery. So this is kind of like your introduction in the book to the importance of supplementary school, but education for Blacks in general. And then you make the point also that Du Bois went on to say that as a part of this process of education, one of the biggest things we did was build our own culture, our inner culture, which some of us now question, do we even have one? And it is the culture of popular choice, Black culture of Blacks throughout the world and of the world, period. So my question is, how does this set of insights impact on, and how did it affect your decision to build the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center?
Well, like trying to reflect back on that, see, like I noticed, like when they have schools, it's all the schools we have in the country more or less are Eurocentrically oriented. And see, but I grew up going to black schools, and they would induce black culture into the schools. But once schools integrated, that was lost. So we started the Learning Center. We wanted to have our kids read material that would raise their consciousness. Like in our reading program, like I used to be on the library board one time, and they were trying to encourage kids to read. And I told the director of the library, I said, it's more important for our kids to read 2 articles about Frederick and Harriet than 10 books about Dick and Jane.
Mm-hmm.
So like in the Learning Center, well, we're teaching kids how to read, but what are you reading? You don't have them reading about Dick and Jane while you teach them how to read. Have them read some stuff that's culturally relevant. And we would have a material in the Learning Center that was culturally relevant where those kids would learn how to read. So you're teaching 2 things at once. You're teaching them how to read, and you're also raising their cultural consciousness. And you can do that with all the subject matters. Not only reading, but with math and science and whatever else you're doing. You, to the best that we can, make it culturally relevant, because that's what motivates and inspires children. I never will forget that one of my mentors, Dr. Jeremiah Cameron, Ajamu knows who I'm talking about. He told me one time the most important thing y'all doing is really not the tutoring. Y'all have adult role models that those kids can emulate. So they were seeing adults from the community who were giving back to the community to help uplift the community. And that in itself was motivating the kids beyond what we would realize. I mean, to have somebody look like them running this stuff down to them.
Right.
And we had a lot of kids who realized that they had the potential to be engineers and scientists and this, that, and other. Why? Because they were tutored by people like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of Ajamu's closest friends who went to Southern University, Bridget, one of my favorite stories, she was working with this young girl. See, we was getting kids skipped in school. And so this girl was in the 7th grade taking geometry. And one of the young sisters working with her was an engineer from Southern. She said, well, what do you do? She said, oh, I'm an engineer. She said, yeah, sure, I asked Bucks, she said, what kind of, she said, like, she's a mechanical engineer. So she explained to her. So that young girl right then and there made up her mind she wanted to be a mechanical engineer. And she went down to not Southern, but Prairie View, So we was encouraging kids to go to historical black colleges because a lot of our teachers were from historical black colleges. And so they knew some of the teachers back there, and we set up relationships where we could help kids get scholarships, not only athletic, but academic as well, at historical black colleges.
Now, the point you're making here about role models, this is really key to African and African American culture. In European culture, knowledge is learned through information and regurgitation. That's basically their system. And then they'll polish it up and call it creativity. But the way knowledge is learned in African and African American culture, there's a saying in Kemet, speak truth, do truth. To know the truth is to be the truth. First of all, knowledge comes from truth. In Western thought, it comes from facts. Some truths, if you're dealing with science, if you're dealing with mathematics, there's some truths you have to teach. But the essence of truth is an ethical thing? No, that's not what their system is based on. It's facts. But Africans know, and African Americans know, truth is the source for everything. It's a source of wisdom. And how do you know the truth? By being it. It gets to be explained to you, but you have to be it. And so when they see living embodiments of the truth, in this particular case, in a profession, that encourages them to be it because it's their culture. And that's the highest level of learning. And by the way, the book I'm finishing now, it breaks the paradigm for teaching because we have African-centered thought and a European method for teaching it. We teach the same way white people do. We give people the information. But what we need to do is know how to bring out of the student what they have so they can be it. That's what knowledge is. That's what wisdom is. And when you have that, then it's a total learning, mind, body, and spirit. With white people, it's only mind. And those who get the spirit, it's by accident, the Einsteins and the others that do the breakthrough stuff. But in us, it's our culture. It's in our culture, but we need to be able to explicate it, use that word, and apply it. And so that's crucial. So that example you're given is very, very important because that living example, in this case, it also said, well, I can do it. But it's the being of it. She was seeing somebody living it. You know what I mean?
Well, there's a proverb that says children learn more from what you are than what you teach.